Yeah, what are you going to do with that?
So believe it or not, I had fun with these readings. It's hard to believe. But anyway, I did. So when I was an early teenager, I used to read these heart-throbbing romance stories where, now I know to say this, where those of us who are straight women were carried off into the sunset by these really cool guys to this wonderful future, I guess, to Never Never Land. One particular novel that I read, I always remember this because it offered a recipe how to be a good wife. And that recipe was the reading that we did today. The book directed us to Proverbs 31. And you would go along the verses and find out where your birthday was. And that's what God, AKA man, had in store for you. So when I was a kid, never having read Proverbs, I got my grandmother's Bible and I expected something really wonderful. And instead it said, she makes linen garments and sells them, which was completely foreign to me. Would have been completely foreign to my mother too. Sewing was never my strong point. Now, if it had said she'll mow the lawn for the rest of her life, it would have made more sense to me. So our reading today is a snapshot of a dutiful wife, according to covenant marriages, if you know what they are. And if you continue to read the passage to the end, our worthy wife rises before dawn. She works 24/7 to keep the household together and her husband happy. In fact, her lamp doesn't even go out at night. Meanwhile, her husband sits at the town gates and shoots the breeze with the rest of the guys. And one can only hope that he made her 1/10 as happy as she made him. And the chapter ends with a warning in the guise of a backhanded compliment. Make sure that this woman doesn't have time to worry about her looks or time to attend to her own needs, because she needs to be busy in order to keep herself out of trouble, because you know what happens when women have too much time on their hands. So at one time, I remember reading a story about an African chief who worried what the women in his village were going to do with their time now that they had a well and they didn't have to walk 5 miles back and forth to get water to prepare their lunch while they sat around the campfire shooting the breeze with their buddies. So anyway, obviously there is not, the story is not completely wrong. And if that's the woman's choice. And I don't know about you, but I know women like that. And one of them was my mother, who really loved her home and she was perfectly happy. She would tell you, I'm perfectly happy to be here and take care of my home. And, around this time of the year, she'd wash all her knickknacks and wash her curtains and wash her house. And she was as happy as a clam because that's what mattered to her. So I don't mean to malign women like that. But what's problematic with the first reading is that far too many women were forced to bury their talents in someone else's idea of domestic tranquility. The patriarchs in charge expected and even required women to offer up their lives for others without their consent and sometimes without their will, against their will, declaring that sacrifice was the will of God. And thus there were many women and there were many men too who were forced to bury their treasures in their parents', their churches, or their society's treasure chest instead of their own. Now, I'm not talking about the necessary sacrifices that we all make on a daily basis in order to live in our families and keep societies going. That's just a natural part of life. I'm talking about being forced to live a life that continues to hurt us and impair our development as human beings because someone else decided that this is what we were supposed to do. So families and societies are based on traditions, and many of them are good, like manners, civility, virtuous living. We don't want to live in society without those things. But others are really terrible, and most of them revolve around women, like foot binding, purdah, female circumcision, the imposed veiling of women, and the denial of suffrage and the priesthood to women. And efforts to place women on an equal plane with men are perceived often by those in power as affronts to a religious society whose traditions were designed by men, but baptized as the intention of God. Thus, too many people will do just about anything to maintain the status quo, which they believe bestows what our second reading calls peace and security upon families and societies. However, this sense of peace and security is usually reserved for those who are at the top or think they are at the top, who fear losing their possessions, their position and their possessions, just as fear of the master made our poor hapless servant today bury his talents. And it's rather sad to think that the poor slob who knew enough about the behavior of high status folks who knew enough to be afraid about I'm sorry, let me start that over again because it's really important that I say this right. It's really sad to think that the poor slob who knew enough about the behavior of high status folks to be afraid is the guy who got punished, while the master, who liked his servants as long as they built up his fortune, is the star of the gospel. And the reality is that the other servants, had they lost their master's money, they would have been whipped or sent to prison for playing the ancient version of the stock market. And we would be lauding the slave who had enough sense to bury the money. And so the master's behavior is horrifying and not consoling. Our second reading, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, predates the Gospel of Matthew by maybe 40 years. A lot of things happened during those decades that might have changed the trajectory of what would have eventually become Christianity. And if we had read the next several verses of his letter, we would have learned that unlike Matthew, who threw the justifiably fearful servant outside into the darkness where he would wail and gnash his teeth, Paul wrote that our loving God does not subject people to divine wrath. Paul's early letter directly opposes Matthew's later notion of an angry deity and better preserves the compassion of Jesus. It was later believers like Matthew and his community who declared that their fellow human beings were guilty of God's punishment. And in his letter, Paul goes on to say that rather than condemnation, believers should encourage each other and build up one another. And his words are inspiring. He wrote, "Be at peace among yourselves, admonish the idlers, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, and be patient with all of them. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all." Most importantly, he says that Christians are not to quench the spirit, which I think is one of the best lines in all of Scripture. And had believers listened to that, the world might be a very different place today. And so, my friends, the good news is that the Spirit is not bound to any tradition, especially one that pigeonholes people. She obeys no human being and recognizes no human authority or tradition. The Spirit is not the patriarchy's pet dog who obeys their every beck and call. She will blow where she will, and she will be who she will be, upending traditions and introducing new, more life-giving ones that lead to the full flourishing of human beings rather than to just a few. And her holy name should never, ever be invoked to justify inequality, power, or violence. She does not expect anyone to work from morning till night unless they want to. She does not expect people to sacrifice themselves to the dictates of power. She does not recognize masters and servants. She does not leave her people, her beloved people, outside the pale, weeping and gnashing their teeth when they make their many expected mistakes. Rather, she draws them close by the power of her love, by the fire of her love, kisses them with a holy kiss, and sets their feet back upon the path of righteousness. And the love of that unquenchable spirit is always there for the asking. It is not rationed. It is not judgmental. It does not favor one group or another. It is just pressed down and overflowing into our laps. And there, most importantly, there is no such thing as the wrath of God. Instead, it is the wrath of man that destroys families, communities, and entire civilizations. The great fiery love of the Spirit for all creations, my friends, that is our peace and security, not tradition, not the status quo, and not preconceived ideas. And this is our blessed assurance as children of God. And so, my friends, while humility is indeed a virtue, never, ever be subservient. Breathe always without restriction and swirl with the sacred winds that want to take you to a very different place. Be who you want to be and show up every day to your present call. And in our small, imperfect way, with the help of God, we will renew our own little corner of the world.